Hi, unfortunately, I'm Bulgarian.
You're in Bulgaria.
I don't say that for credibility points. I say it because my country is a warning label. When Americans argue online about whether their system is really in danger, I feel like the guy who already burned himself on the hot stove, watching somebody else lean in and say, how bad could it be? So this video is not about dunking on America, it's an advice from someone who lives in an already failed state. If you want to avoid living in one, please, Americans, don't do what we did. Let me clarify something first. A failed state isn't always bombs, civil war, or total collapse.
But Liam was seized by ICE officers in Minneapolis on Tuesday and is now believed to be more than 1,000 miles away in detention in Texas with his father.
He's a bright young student and he's so kind. All I want is for him to be safe and back here.
The school district superintendent said officers had used a 5-year-old as bait.
Sometimes it looks like institutions that technically exist but don't work, elections that happen but don't change anything, laws that apply differently depending on who you are, or people who don't trust anyone, not politicians, not media, and certainly not even themselves. Bulgaria has elections, courts, police, a constitution, and yet most people live with the quiet understanding that the system is not for them. And before you say, well, duh, all those things apply for us Americans as well. The system is not working for us either. Why do you think the US is the richest country in the world? Why do you think the US dominates the world? It's exactly because of your stable, functioning, democratic institutions, your robust legal system, your advanced military, the individual freedoms that are enshrined in your constitution. Now, do you have problems? Yes, of course, every country has problems. However, somehow you Americans have become convinced that everything around you is crumbling. You've been so protected and so sheltered by your own wealth and privilege, bellies filled with processed sugars, and so high off of that sweet propaganda nectar that you've become convinced the only way out of this mess is electing a fascist wannabe dictator. And paradoxically, almost like a self-fulfilled prophecy, your decision to elect this cartoonishly corrupt moron is causing the very thing you're scared of, the dismantling of the strong, capable institutions that enabled you to become so fucking rich in the first place. And let me tell you a thing or two about what a dismantled state really looks like. Let me tell you a story about how corruption takes hold of a country and turns into a kleptocracy. Between 1944 and 1989, my home country, Bulgaria, was under communist rule. The state officially claimed that there is no corruption because the state owned everything, and ideology insisted that class exploitation was gone. In reality, corruption existed in many forms, all of which laid the groundwork for what came later. Bulgaria was one of the most loyal Soviet satellite states, ruled for 35 years by Todor Zhivkov. Power was naturally concentrated in the Communist Party elite. Party officials had special shops, housing, healthcare, cars, and were allowed to travel to foreign countries. Access to goods depended on connections and not law. Loyalty to the party mattered more than competence or legality. That ring any bells? This created a culture where rules were for ordinary people, while insiders lived above them. That mentality survived well after the regime. Because the planned economy failed to meet demand, basic goods, for example meat, appliances, building materials, were scarce. People relied on bribes and favors. Success was often related to how well connected you were with the party. Doctors, factory managers, clerks, and police all expected gifts. To this day, whenever a Bulgarian undergoes some kind of medical operation, you're expected to carry some presents for the doctor. Corruption wasn't seen as immoral, it was just how you survived. It was normalized. Bribery was seen as practical problem solving, and informal deals substituted formal institutions. Bulgaria's secret police, also known as state security, officially fought economic crimes. In practice, however, they controlled smuggling routes, ran foreign currency schemes, managed front companies abroad, and learned how to hide money and bypass controls. These networks did not disappear in 1989 after the fall of the regime. They only evolved. When communism collapsed in 1989, Bulgaria did not experience a clean break. There was no lustration, no serious prosecutions, no confiscation of stolen assets. Instead, the same elites rebranded themselves. And so, former communists became capitalists overnight. The people best positioned to win after 1989 were of course the Communist Party officials, the state security officers, and managers of state enterprises. These people controlled everything. So when privatization began, they bought state assets for pennies, often using insider loans from state banks, which they also controlled, fake bankruptcy schemes, and newly found shell companies. This is how political power turned directly into private wealth. During the 1990s, organized crime groups flourished. Many were led by former athletes, security officers, or secret police officers. They handled insurance schemes, smuggling, drugs, fuel, and arms. Of course, the institutions who would otherwise prevent this from happening were not only disempowered, they were actively helping the criminals. Crucially, the police didn't stop them, the courts didn't prosecute them, and politicians were often working with them. And so, with these institutions in the pocket of a few wealthy mafia oligarchs, the Bulgarian state and organized crime fused into one. One of the most devastating moments at that time was the collapse of the banking system, which was a deliberate and controlled looting operation. State-controlled banks began issuing huge loans to politically connected businessmen and their newly created private firms with no assets in them. These were criminal-linked companies owned by former party elites, reinvented as entrepreneurs. Loans were, of course, often unsecured, and borrowers, of course, had no intention of repaying them. After all, the idea was to siphon money from the Bulgarian people through the banking sector. The beneficiaries of this controlled robbery later became known as credit millionaires. This triggered hyperinflation and the collapse of Bulgaria's national currency. People's savings became worthless in months. After this, not one important person went to prison. This taught Bulgaria a brutal lesson. Crime on a massive scale is rewarded, not punished, and institutions protect power, not the people. Why corruption became so entrenched instead of transitional after the fall of communism? Unlike some Eastern European countries, Bulgaria kept former communists in power under new party names pretending to be democratic. It never cleaned the judiciary, it never reformed prosecution services, never broke the secret police networks. This is how corruption became structural and normalized. The first and biggest mistake that a nation can do is normalizing corruption. As we saw in Bulgaria, corruption didn't arrive overnight. It crept in slowly and people just laid down their guard and gave up instead of standing up to it. And here's the dangerous part. Once corruption becomes normal, honest people are punished for following the rules. So they either leave the country or they adapt. America, if you ever reach the point where corruption is shrugged off as politics as usual, which in my humble opinion you are very close to at this point, you are already in freefall. In Bulgaria, nobody believes that institutions will protect them. Courts, slow and selective. Police, depends on who you are. Regulators, work to protect the criminals instead of catching them. When institutions lose legitimacy, people don't become revolutionary. They often become cynical. They stop participating, they stop voting, they stop caring. And then the worst people take over because they do care. They care about power. America, be careful when distrust turns into total disengagement. A system doesn't collapse when people protest. It collapses when people say nothing matters anyway. In Bulgaria, media capture doesn't mean total censorship. It means selective outrage. Stories buried or amplified based on who they heard, and confusion replacing clarity. Once truth becomes tribal, reality itself fractures. America, a free press doesn't just mean many outlets. It doesn't mean establishment media or independent online media. It means a media that can survive without serving power. Those that and lies don't even need to be convincing. They just need to be loud. Here's the most painful part. In Bulgaria, the people who could fix things left. Doctors, engineers, capable people. Not because they hated the country, but because they were tired of fighting a system that punished effort. A failed state doesn't always explode. Sometimes it just empties out by itself. America, if your best people start seeing exit as the only rational choice, pay attention. In Bulgaria, we rarely argue about ideology anymore. Left, right, it doesn't matter. Real power belongs to oligarchs. One man, called Delan Peevski, a politician, a media mogul, and a shallow power broker, controls everything in Bulgaria. He was sanctioned by the United States for corruption, but nothing came out of that. He didn't disappear, he didn't go to jail, he stayed ever so powerful. The reason behind this is the fact that Bulgarian institutions are weak, and when institutions are weak and powerless, money replaces law. Peevski controls large parts of the media and the most important institutions tasked with investigating and prosecuting crimes. He has economic influence via state business ties. He makes sure that people loyal to him win state contracts, have access to credit and regulatory favors, and have protection from inspections or penalties. This is how oligarch power actually works. Not one company, but a web of dependency. And this is crucial for Americans to understand. Corruption doesn't need everyone to be corrupt, although it seems like a lot of people around Trump are just outright corrupt and don't even try to hide it. In any case, corruption just needs enough people to be afraid and to not do anything. This paralyzed state of apathy, cynicism, and hopelessness is a perfect breeding ground for oligarchs to take over. Politics becomes a source of exhaustion. That's enough to warp a democracy without ending it. Peevski, for example, doesn't control Bulgaria like a dictator. He distorts it like a parasite, quietly, legally, and effectively. Here's the good news. America is not Bulgaria. Your institutions are stronger. Your civil society is deeper. Your economy gives you margin for error. But margin for error isn't infinite. Take corruption seriously. Defend institutions even when they inconvenience you. Reject tribalism. Demand better media. Because once failure becomes normal, it's incredibly hard to reverse. I genuinely hope this video doesn't appear as an attack. It was a warning from someone who was already living with the consequences of entrenched corruption and powerless institutions. Take it or leave it, but don't say nobody warned you.